Defence Dialogue, a podcast discussing contemporary challenges in the area of European security and defence. Brought to you by the Martens Centre with Nicholas Novacki.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies Defence Dialogue podcast series. My name is Dr. Nicholas Novacki, and as always I'll be your host for this episode, and with me again for this episode is my colleague and good friend Alvaro de la Cruz from the communications team. So Alvaro, good to have you here again, and it's been a while since we recorded the last episode, but it's good to do this one before the summer.
Yeah, thank you to have me. I'm really happy to be back, and most of all, I'm really happy to be able to finally say welcome to NATO, Finland, Sweden. It's been a long wait, but oh my God, it feels good.
Well, let's not jinx it quite yet, because I mean there might still be like some time to go. Just have to hope that all of the allies approve the accession of both Finland and Sweden as quickly as possible. But yeah, it's been a rather interesting year. And if somebody had asked me like earlier this year, at the beginning of the year, I mean, if Finland and Sweden would apply for NATO, or actually like a few years ago, I mean, if what would be more likely, Finland and Sweden applying for NATO or a global pandemic shutting down the economy, I mean, I would have probably laughed at both options, like, to be honest at you. But yeah, I mean, it's a strange time. But yeah, like going from Finland and Sweden to joining NATO, it's not actually too far from the issue that I wanted to like discuss today, which is NATO's new 2022 strategic concept and what it means for the alliance and etc. So NATO adopted a new strategic concept at its Madrid summit at the end of June, and this is the I believe eighth strategic concept that NATO has adopted since its founding in 1949, and the fourth since the end of the Cold War. And the strategic concept is a very important document for NATO because it describes NATO's security environment, it reaffirms its core values and principles, it spells out NATO's purpose, and it also defines its core tasks. So a very important strategic document. The previous strategic concept was adopted all the way back in 2010 when NATO had its summit in Lisbon. And this was, of course, a period in time when NATO faced a completely like different strategic environment and a completely different set of challenges than it faces today. And indeed, the new strategic concept has been adopted at what is a rather challenging moment in time and in history for NATO. And a lot has changed like since the previous strategic concept was adopted. So Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and now it has launched an unprovoked war against Ukraine. I mean, which began in February of this year, as we all know. And it's interesting when you look at the 2010 strategic concept. Russia is still described as a partner in that document, but in the new document, Russia is very clearly described as the most significant and direct threat to the Allied security and to peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. So it's a rather different formulation, which I believe like reflects quite well the moment in time that the Allies are currently like facing. China's foreign policy and geopolitical ambitions are also a much bigger challenge in the current new strategic concept that NATO adopted. In the 2010 document, China wasn't mentioned even once, but in the new document, it's mentioned, I believe, around like 10 times or so. So it also discusses quite extensively the challenge that China poses to the alliance and its members, like both in Europe and then in the Indo-Pacific, of course. NATO has also ended its major out-of-area operation in Afghanistan. We all remember the chaotic kind of withdrawal operation from Afghanistan in autumn 2021. But of course, the NATO mission, like, they had already like ended before. But like Afghanistan is no longer an area where NATO is involved. And of course, I mean, there's also a whole bunch of other issues and challenges that have come on NATO's agenda since 2010, such as new technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the security implications of climate change, China, I already mentioned, cybersecurity in general. So there's quite a lot, and health security, of course. I mean, given the coronavirus pandemic that we're still not quite over yet, but the security landscape and the threats that NATO faces today are rather different compared to the threats that it was facing in 2010. So, as I already mentioned, the strategic concept defines NATO's tasks and core missions. So what are these? The new document says that NATO's purpose is to ensure the collective defense of its members, and that it will have 3 core tasks. And these are deterrence and defense, crisis prevention and management, and then cooperative security. And I think kind of like when you have a look at the new document, I think the key takeaway from it is that NATO is really refocusing on its traditional mission of collective defense, of ensuring the defense of Europe, especially against the threat coming from the East and in particular from Russia. I think Russia's actions, like since 2010, the annexation of Crimea and now the unprovoked war against Ukraine, have really made NATO refocus on this traditional mission that it has had. And it's been a rather quick refocusing, because we remember that since the 1990s, there was a period in time in which NATO's core mission almost was out of area crisis management and intervening in places like Bosnia and Herzegovina and Afghanistan, but that has changed. And it's also interesting and I would say rather understandable that the first core challenge mentioned in the strategic concept is the continuing war in Ukraine, and this of course kind of reflects the moment in time that we are in. Interestingly, terrorism is the second kind of core challenge that is mentioned, and I think kind of this also kind of reflects 2 things. Terrorism is still a key threat and a key challenge that allies face, but it also underlines the fact that allies continue to face like a rather different set of challenges. And we spoke earlier, Alvaro, about the Finnish-Swedish like NATO accession process, and there was a period, a rather frustrating period during that accession process before NATO formally approved the beginning of Finland's and Sweden's accession process, in which Turkey was objecting to Finland and Sweden joining NATO on the grounds that, in Turkey's view, like they did not take Turkey's concerns about terrorism seriously enough, and Turkey has been really kind of pushing this terrorism narrative within NATO, and I think kind of this reflects that. But of course, terrorism is a challenge that continues to also like trouble other NATO allies as well. We've had incidents quite recently, like in Europe as well, so we should not forget the challenge of terrorism. Perhaps like just also something that came to my mind is that in the media and in many discussions, I mean, the strategic concept is also viewed almost, in the Brussels bubble at least, it's viewed as a very similar document than like the strategic compass that the EU adopted at the end of March. But I think it's important to underline that the strategic concept that NATO adopted and the EU's own strategic compass have to be kind of careful not to kind of confuse strategic concept with strategic compass. It's very difficult to memorize and remember, but it's important to emphasize that these are 2 like rather different, I would say fundamentally different documents. And the difference comes from the purpose, like, of the 2 documents. Like, the purpose of NATO, the NATO document, is really to define like NATO's purpose and core mission. So what NATO is all about, what its key tasks are, and what the alliance should do. But the purpose of the strategic compass, on the one hand, is simply to guide the development of the EU security and defense policy from today until 2030. It does not seek to define the purpose of the EU security and defense policy. And it's when you go through the document, like there's no attempt to do that. There's a description of the EU's security environment, and then a whole bunch of 50 or 60 key concrete action proposals that the EU should undertake between now and 2030 to boost the effectiveness and credibility of its own security and defense policy. And the 2 documents are also rather different in size. I mean, the NATO paper is about 12 pages, I think, but the EU one is close to 60. The purpose of the EU security and defense policy is, of course, like defined in the Treaty on the European Union in Articles 42.1 and 42.2. I mean, which simply like mentioned that it is about providing the EU with the capacity to conduct out-of-area operations, and that the common security and defense policy shall include the progressive framing of common defense policy among the union. So rather different documents, the two. But yeah, I mean, interesting times. Lots of strategy. I do apologize that, and I do understand, dear listeners. I mean, if you as well, like, I mean, might confuse the strategic concept with the strategic compass. So there's a lot of different strategies like going on in this discussion. So it's not very easy to follow always. And I do also apologize about my voice because I do have something in my chest. So hopefully all of you are fine. But yeah, what do you think, Alvaro?
Yeah, well, first of all, what I would like to ask you, Nicholas, is, so far in these 80 years of NATO, more or less, we had one strategic concept every decade, roughly.
Yeah.
With the accelerating, changing environment in security and defense environment, not only in Europe, but in the Pacific. First of all, is it realistic to consider this strategic concept will be valid for the next decade or so? And if not, if the situation changes as fast as it happened since 2014, how easy would it be for NATO to adapt or evolve this strategic concept or create a new one in the next few years if needed?
Well, I think kind of two things. Like it takes, like the security environment has changed dramatically, like since the 2010 document, but it's been an like incremental change, I would think. I mean, it's been kind of, there's been kind of progressive steps or progressive challenges have mounted. And in the end, like we now face a completely like different security environment that we did back in 2010. Also, NATO, of course, has already kind of adapted to the new challenges, new environment, like when they have changed. The strategic concept, like, of course, kind of plays an important like role in like setting kind of NATO's core mission and tasks. But NATO is in a constant state or process of adopting and adapting to new challenges and threats when they emerge. I mean, it doesn't rigidly stick to the strategic concept that it has. So if something happens that requires NATO to adapt, become more flexible, change its posture, it can do that, of course. But I think, or I do hope that we can stick to this new strategic concept, at least for the time being, and then perhaps after a decade or so, we can again like have a look if we need to adapt the core purpose and mission of NATO.
Okay, yeah, because on the 8th point of the strategic concept in the strategic environment section, the first sentence says literally, the Russian Federation is the most significant and direct threat to Allied security and to peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. So the thing is, in the next decade, Putin might very well die for natural causes or not. And would this sentence will still be valid if he's not around or if his government falls eventually? So yeah, I'm happy to know that there's flexibility and possibility to adapt, and because of course China is mentioned along the paper everywhere, but I think, in my opinion, China should share some protagonism in this main threat consideration, and they focus a lot on Russia now, and I'm just concerned that that might be the heat of the moment with Russia, but we forget a little bit to give the real importance China deserves. And
yeah, I mean, there's certainly an element of that. I mean, every document like this, whether it's produced by NATO or the European Union, I mean, to some extent, like reflects the environment and the context in which it was produced, and both the strategic concept and the EU strategic compass were produced against the background of, first of all, the Russian military buildup along the border of Ukraine, and then since February, the ongoing invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. So this, of course, given that it is happening so close to Europe itself, influences like both documents like very heavily. But I would say that when you have a look at when you go through the strategic concept in particular, like it does address like quite effectively like also the various other aspects or various other challenges that NATO faces, like whether we talk about China, whether we talk about the security aspects of climate change, cyber security, etc., and cooperating with partners such as the European Union. There's also quite a lot on EU-NATO cooperation, both in the strategic concept and the EU strategic compass, which I think is very good. But I mean, of course, if the hypothetical situation that there would be a change of leadership in the Kremlin, like there would be suddenly a president in Russia, like who would be a model Democrat, and Russia would become like a model democracy and become an open-minded partner to NATO, the European Union, and the United States and the West as a whole, then of course I would imagine that NATO would probably revise like this document and to make it reflect more of the current environment that it faces.
And on EU-NATO cooperation, there's many experts these days discussing whether these strategic concepts and this reboost of NATO may weaken the European strategic autonomy. Do you agree with that? Is it that moment, or is actually strengthening both the European defense and security and NATO compatible?
Well, we have to first ask what is European strategic autonomy as well. I would almost say kind of Europe's strategic autonomy is like also in some way kind of tied to a credible NATO and a credible like transatlantic relationship. But no, I don't think like these two things are not in competition with each other at all. NATO and the European Union, European security and defense policy. What has been really positive in the past years, I think, is that NATO and the United States, more specifically, like have become a lot more positive in their view about the EU's own like security and defense policy, the EU's own aspirations in the field of security and defense, because like in the late 1990s and early 2000s, like when the EU really like began to work in the field of security and defense, there was a little bit of skepticism, I think, in Washington, actually quite a bit of skepticism initially, that the EU would try to kind of replicate what NATO is doing and like develop itself into some sort of military superpower. There was actually a very active academic debate going on in the early 2000s about how the EU is developing into a superpower, which has now like died down when people have like noticed that this is not actually happening. But both like NATO Secretary General like Stoltenberg and like President Biden in the US have emphasized like time and again that the EU security and defense policy is also like a key element that supports NATO's collective defense, especially what the EU is doing in the area of resilience and capability development. This is something that benefits the alliance. And I think kind of we've moved a little bit past the whether the EU should duplicate like, NATO or not debate, which is good.
Sure. And precisely on that issue, on the American scene that not only interested in that Europe develops a good defense capacity, but also that they commit on the spending and on the technical requirements to really be ready to defend Europe themselves. We have also always the question mark of the election in 2024 and whether someone like Donald Trump or someone as radical as him in the Republican Party may come to power again and de facto weaken NATO, or say we are only willing to continue this project if you live to your promises. How probable is that really Europe in the next few years keeps the investment, keeps the mood and the dynamism to really reach these investment and these capabilities, and that we really can demonstrate our American partners that we are here for the long term?
Well, it's difficult to say how probable. I think the like what has happened like since 2016 or so is that both in the EU context and in NATO, and especially now, like given the war in Ukraine, like there's been a little bit of an awakening, especially in countries that are not facing any immediate existential security threats themselves. there's a feeling that we need to take security and defense like more seriously because we face an aggressive Russia. China's ambitions are increasing. It could be possible that perhaps in the future, like when the leadership in the White House like will change, we might have another debate on like whether the United States should withdraw from NATO or not. Because let's not forget that there was a semi-serious debate when Donald Trump was in the White House about whether he might or might not withdraw the United States from NATO. And Europeans, of course, kind of need to be prepared for these sort of things. But fundamentally, what Europeans like need to do is to make sure that they have the capabilities, means, and political willingness to handle their security like by themselves. Because this is not something that's also like good for Europe, but it's also beneficial for NATO and the United States. So the more capable is, I mean, the less likely the United States is to remain interested in what Europe is doing, and feel like it has like worthy allies to cooperate with. Because otherwise, I mean, if we go back to the situation of the late 1990s or like early 2000s when defense budgets like were going down, like the Americans will say like, look, we've been telling you to get serious about this stuff, but I mean, like you're more interested in your kind of social spending and other things, and but you need to chip in. But if it doesn't happen, I mean, it's good luck trying to have an effective NATO and a credible European security and defense policy. But of course, we're now facing a record inflation. Like we're facing a situation in which the economy was almost like shut down for a few years because of the coronavirus pandemic. Lots of spending will have to go into transforming Europe into a more green continent and to implement the European Green Deal. So there will be a lot of like competing demands for like European cash. And although like we're now super focused on security and defense, I mean, a time will come in which other budget lines like will become like more important. It's just the nature of politics. So we have to like wait and see what happens. But I don't expect that this current level of interest and political willingness towards enhancing Europe's role in security and defense is sustainable forever. Because something else like will take over the agenda, and we have to like then we'll have other spending priorities.
Yeah, let's hope so, because only since Madrid already some governments like mine in Madrid agreed on delay the commitment of investment until 2029, and despite the strategic concept has some lines like we will enhance our security, our energy security, and invest in a stable and reliable energy suppliers and sources. Countries like Spain, right after this Madrid summit, continue their deteriorating relations with providers like Algeria, and now for the first time in many years, Spain imports more gas from Russia than from Algeria, which is ironic in this precise moment. So yeah, I'm hoping that the commitment in some of the, especially Western and Southern European countries, will be there for the next years to come. I wanted to ask you, Nicholas, because there's a very interesting, at least to my understanding, a very interesting point in the purpose and principle section, where the strategic concept says, we will strengthen our alliance based on our indivisible security. I wonder how strong are the mechanisms within NATO to enhance and to make sure that this indivisible security is maintained. In, for example, pragmatical examples like Turkey, Greece. A couple of days ago, we have this huge problematic with these government officials of Turkey showcasing a map of Turkey, including
I saw that.
Lots of islands of Greece, and the relations are. The situation is heating up. Is there any way NATO can really ensure this indivisible security among its members?
Yeah, like how indivisible is this indivisible security? It's a good question, but I mean, like there are consultation mechanisms in NATO, and I believe is it Article 4 of the Washington Treaty. Like I have to check, but. Which talks about the need to ensure kind of effective consultation whenever there are security challenges or not. But the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean is, of course, particularly challenging because like it is a case in which like there are issues and tensions like between two NATO allies, and it is something that both the European Union, both NATO and the United States, I mean, have been like trying to kind of like help resolve. And the challenge is that Turkey seems to have like somewhat like revisionist ideas of like where its like territory, like maritime like territory lies, and frustrations about its exclusive economic zones, like, which is of course then creating very understandable nervousness and in Athens, in Greece. And but yeah, I mean, NATO has to continue to try to play a role in like finding some sort of. First of all, both NATO and the EU like need to stand with Greece to ensure that like we protect the territorial kind of sovereignty and the current maritime borders that there are in the Eastern Mediterranean, but they don't also like facilitate like dialogue and like try to kind of normalize like the tensions, relations on the Eastern Mediterranean somewhat a little bit, but it is a challenging situation. And I had something in my mind that I like wanted to also like say to this, but for whatever reason I seem to have like lost it in my track of thought. So I have to kind of see like if it comes back to my mind. But yeah, it does happen sometimes, dear leaders. I do apologize. And
well, I truly hope that the allies really see the big picture, focus, and remain united in the real threats. There are many, and even though, as the strategic concept phrases, the Euro-Atlantic area is not at peace, I hope that we can enjoy our summer in the most peaceful way.
Absolutely. And now I also like remembered like what I wanted to say earlier, like it came back to my mind. It's that if you imagine that the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean is now tense, I mean, like just think how much more tense it would be, I mean, if Turkey would not be a NATO ally. Because I think we forget sometimes that I think NATO has somewhat of a calming effect, probably, and if Turkey would not be in the alliance like with Greece, I mean, then like gloves might come off like even more. That it has somewhat of a stabilizing effect in the Eastern Mediterranean, even though it might not like always look at that. But I think the alliance is still fundamentally better off with Turkey as a member as well. But yeah, thanks a lot to you, Alvaro, again for joining, and it was fun to.
Thank you.
Very interesting to talk about this topic, and thanks to everybody like who was listening. I do hope you will all have a very pleasant summer, and that you will join us again in the autumn, like when we record the next episode. Thanks a lot, and have a very pleasant day. Cheers.
That was today's episode of Defence Dialogue. Subscribe to our podcasts for more.